Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rails 1056, the New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and joy of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Julia Bland and Gaby Collins-Fernandez. And now I'll introduce Julia and Gaby. Julia Bland's geometric compositions are created through a cyclical approach to assembly and disassembly. By weaving, dyeing, sewing, burning, and painting, the surface becomes a visible record of her evolving, multifaceted process. Within this rhythm of making and unmaking, Bland develops the structures, symbols, and patterns that bind disparate elements into a whole. Bland was born in Palo Alto, California, and lives and works in Brooklyn, and she holds a BFA from RISD and an MFA from the Yale School of Art. Our host today, Gaby Collins-Fernandez, is an artist living and working in New York. She holds degrees from Dartmouth College and the Yale School of Art, an MFA in painting and printmaking. Her work has been shown in the US and internationally. She is a founder and publisher of the annual magazine Precog and a co-director of the artist-run art and music initiative Bomb Pop-Up. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Gaby.
Hi, everyone. And as always, thank you to the Brooklyn Rail for hosting these conversations and for having Julia and I on it today. It's a real pleasure and honor to get to have a conversation with Julia Bland today on the occasion of her show, Rivers on the Inside, which just opened at Derek Eller Gallery and is a really stunning, beautiful show. I hope everyone can go see it. And it's especially an honor to go to talk with Julia today because we've been in conversation for many years. We're old peers and friends, and I think that only enriches the dialogue between us, which is really special. So I just wanted to start out by thinking about the show as a whole. In some ways, I think this show encapsulates a lot of things that I've admired about Julia and her work for many, many years now, which is that the works are materially like resplendent. You know, they're filled with texture and color, geometry, scale. There are really substantial scale shifts that happen both in individual artworks and between different artworks. And also that this material logic is structured around these incredibly rigorous conceptual and emotional paradigms that she uses to make textile paintings and engage a conversation that kind of denies a binary between the two. So I wanted to just start out by asking Julia to just sort of give us a little bit of a rundown of the show, maybe what you were thinking as you were making it. And we can get into some sort of framing conversations, I think, around the idea of weaving as a cultural technique, which I know is something that's really important to you, and I think one of the structures that helps organize your practice.
Okay. Thank you for that. And I'm very happy to be here with you talking about the show today. So thanks. Yeah, this show, maybe just going off of something that you already brought up in your introduction there, is this like anti-binary thinking. I feel like that's been very true for me as I've been negotiating weaving as a very complex sort of infinite practice on its own, and painting also is like an equally complex sort of infinite world on its own, and to be able to work within both things without thinking of them as binary has been really important to me in my explorations. And one way that I think I furthered that idea here was also by thinking about weaving, which is often talked about and understood as a binary practice of like the warp and the weft, or when people describe weaving as an early precursor to like computer systems of like 0, 1, 0, 1, it's kind of often framed as a binary system. which is like super useful and amazing, and something that's been very generative, you know, unimaginably generative. And at the same time, it's also a surface. It's not, weaving itself is a constructed practice, and the binary is constructed, and the threads that make up the warp and the weft are spun from fibers that are like wild and unwieldy and want to do lots of different things besides become a grid. So I think even thinking about weaving also in that way has opened up possibilities for me in this body of work, where maybe some of the imagery and ideas in previous bodies of work were generated through the process of weaving and through the loom. I think some of this imagery, it goes kind of deeper down into the very beginnings of just even putting the threads together and the mushiness of it before it becomes, the process of weaving.
Well, I think one thing which is really interesting about what you're saying, Julia, is that first of all, there are a number of different processes that create a material that can create an image, and that assuming that we start from maybe some kind of neutral starting point is maybe just bad news for all parties. But hearing you talk about even the composition of the thread that happens before weaving even begins also kind of brings to mind both the variety of the textiles that you're using in this body of work, the fact that you hand weave a large portion of the surfaces, and then a lot of there are some textiles that are found that are included that have very particular personal significance to you. And you also use linen as a kind of nod, almost treating linen as a found painting material or something like this. And that on top of all of that, the processes that you're using to make the works are also complicated and integrated, right? So it's not just the process of weaving, but there's also braiding, there's sewing, there's taking fabrics apart, there's putting fabrics back together, there's painting on top of all of this. I think in your press release, the different processes are listed as assembly, deassembly, gathering, and sorting. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the significance for you about these different modes of putting things together that almost are kind of the base structure from which these other elements in the work, which I know we're going to get to talk about, color, image, metaphor, the facticity of the surface, that all of these come from these other processes that themselves are also really loaded, right? A braid is quite different from a stitch, is quite different from a weave or a gesture.
Yeah. Yeah, each of these things is always developing. Some of them feel really foundational to me and important, and then they vanish, from my work for years, and then maybe they come back later. So, it's an evolving thing, but as an artist, I feel well, this idea of cultural technique that that these distinctions are things that we perform or do, or rituals, and that in the case of weaving, the things that you do also produce an image. So it occupies this very interesting and fluid place as a maker, where I am really tied to and this idea of just doing things. So if I'm weaving, what am I'm doing this thing, versus if I'm braiding something, I'm doing a different thing, or dyeing something, and that these distinctions develop in relationship to each other, And then they also produce images, and they produce objects that then have to be in conversation with each other in the work. So yeah, it is important to me. And using the different materials that I've collected over many years, like my family's clothes and sheets. Yeah, these things have just become like more and more important to me over the years. And whereas I used to kind of just say, oh, found materials in this body of work, I felt like, no, these materials really have a story, and they have patterns, and they have history. And I'm not putting them in there by accident. So let's let them have their place. And they're there in like small areas, but I think they only need a little bit to have their voice heard in the context of everything else that's happening.
It's
So
oh, sorry.
go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I believe Blue Womb is the painting. It's a painting that we have a detail of up right now. But in that painting, there's like a section of a baby blanket, and that the resonance of that means something in particular, right? Because the way that I know that it's a baby blanket is because it's blue, and it's like hospital blue and pink or something like this. But that like seeing that next to a braid, right, feels really different because of the associations that we have, which precede the structure, right? Because I know that fabric can be braided, and also hair is braided, or ropes are braided and knotted in particular kinds of ways. And I think that's really interesting because it kind of like it brings these very sort of like geometric, like really formally complicated, beautiful paintings also into the space of how we understand things through our bodies, right? And then this very, very deep historical relationship between the textile and the body, right? As a covering, as a shroud, you know, like as tapestries inside of buildings, et cetera. So that was just sort of a reflection on how you were talking about some of these questions, but that the personal elements of the found materials feel really amplified by the diversity of processes that you're using in making these. And I was wondering if you could also tell us a little bit more about how your experience of like this kind of embodied knowledge comes into play with this work.
Yeah, I mean the distinction between sort of private and public, I feel like has become really important and interesting to me. Like, is this object, it's like on display in a public space, but what's like, where did it come from? And like having such an intimate object included in it, like a baby blanket, which is such a private space, you know? So like kind of blurring that, and then thinking about abstraction and art as like this very like public thing, you know, devoid of like the personal, or devoid of like subjectivity, even in some cases, to then be sort of put together with these things that are like just so private, you know, like do they even have a place in an artwork? Um, um, so, but then also thinking about like the fabric itself in that case, I think also ties into it, because it's an abstract pattern. It's just some stripes, and the colors happen to be like very similar to the colors that were in the rest of the piece I was using. But they're so iconic. Like you really can't look at them without thinking of that. You know, they're not subjective, you know. I mean, of course they have some subjectivity, but to a pretty large American audience, I think they would be recognizable. So yeah, I was interested in that. And then in terms of like embodied knowledge, do you mean sort of like through the process of learning to weave, or in terms of the imagery, or?
I think however that comes to structure your process in making the work.
Well, I recently read this like very interesting metaphor that I felt really spoke to me about embodied knowledge, which was about a vase or a vessel, and how a vessel was like originally formed in order to carry things, but after it was produced, it like um, came forth the idea of emptiness and fullness. So before there was a vessel, it was sort of impossible to think about um, emptiness and fullness. And then you have this object that like all of a sudden introduces this new idea. And weaving for me was just learning to weave was very much like that, where I was doing this thing and I was just getting all of these ideas that I just didn't have before about image, and about the wider world, and how like the things I was making would come into conversation with them. But that the process of weaving without that and without learning, and I'm still learning, it is like an infinite practice. So the more I learn about it, I feel like the more my ideas about it are challenged. Yeah. So, I mean, sorry, I guess I could continue a little bit.
Please. Yeah,
Like
please.
maybe a very early idea I had, that was like one of the biggest surprises for me was when I was still kind of like developing imagery, like really thinking about it as a grid, the woven structure as a grid and working within that. And then suddenly I realized that the threads were making a zigzag shape, and that they weren't, going out infinitely. They were folding back and forth. And that just in relationship to structures of thinking about time opened up like this whole new way of thinking about structure, about time, about image, just everything. And then for like many years, like the zigzag kind of structured everything I was doing.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Because as I was looking at your work, the idea of the zigzag inside of weaving is something which like almost it like builds time into the surface in a way that you can follow literally, right? And that the relationship between that function of time and like a function of time that you brought up earlier, which is that of like an icon or something which is immediately recognizable, right? Seem as though they would function almost in opposition to one another, that you would have this sort of structure which is more related to almost a narrative, right? The idea that like you can see how text and textile are related etymologically when you see how you can follow the thread with your eyes, versus the idea of the icon preceding the meaning of the icon preceding the experience of the work, right? Because you can recognize what the meaning of the symbol or of the sign is before you encounter it. And yet both of those are tools of storytelling. And I think there's actually quite a lot of storytelling in this body of work. So there are these embedded approaches to time through weaving, and then there are very particular kinds of icons and iconography that you're using. So I was going to ask you a question about time, but maybe also this is a question about story, like how you're thinking about story and image.
Well, interestingly, I think that actually, when you talk about like measuring time and understanding time, you always need both. Like in order to like time is, you have to have a kind of infinite and cyclical concept of it. And you need this like back and forth, like a TikTok, kind of like night, day, right, left motion. And then you need like like in a clock, like a circle, like something that is continuous, like something that shows you the infiniteness of it, and that all of our concepts of time sort of like need both parts of that in order to make sense or resonate as we measure. Anyway, and when it comes to story, well, I'm not sure. There's a lot of stories in the work. And it's, you know, it's about the structure of the story, I guess, for me. But then there also like are the personal things that come in there. And I don't know. It's kind of a hard thing for me to talk about directly, I guess. Um, I will say that like in this work, I really made an effort to kind of try to push things, like to include, like I was really trying to challenge symmetry, which is maybe something we can talk about later, and some of the forms that I had been using. And one of the ways that I did that was to kind of include more information, like as opposed, like I really wanted to develop the symmetry without abandoning it and without necessarily like contradicting it like wholeheartedly. Um, and so one of the ways is just trying to have more information. Like, what can I include that will sort of disrupt this and complicate it without negating it? And I think like some of these more personal elements, some of these more specific things that I did were one way of doing that, kind of including everything.
Yeah, that's I think that's really interesting because like I guess maybe my question made it seem as though someone coming in to look at your work would like understand a narrative or something like this, which is kind of like no. And it's interesting because like your response, which is to this impulse to add more information or to complicate both on the level of process and on the level of overlay is so connected to the material experience of the work. Where things are knotted on top of each other. I mean, the small works are a great example of this, right? The image that we're looking at now, you can see like flat planes, grids that are pieces of yarn or of thread that are knotted on top of them. There's an X which is made of a material which is painted, and then an X which is painted on the open weave like gridded structure as a painted image. And having all of this variability allows me both to recognize the things that I recognize and also undermines the stability of any of those things as being like finite or like concrete in the way that I think they might be in my mind. And so like thinking about story, I think is interesting because I'm like, on some level, this is a little bit of a reach, I know, right? But like this painting is, or this piece, I say painting because I'm a painter. And so, this piece in some ways is like this abstracted story or meditation or proposition about like how to paint an X or how to make an X, which is also how to divide a surface and how to treat a surface as both all over and a surface that has particular locations, right? How do you have a structure and also a way of locating yourself inside of a structure? And one of the things about your work, which is so pleasurable, I think, looking at it, is that you set a viewer up for a certain kind of expectation visually, and then undermine it in terms of the process, both in terms of like how close you might get to the painting and where something becomes denied that you thought was a certain way. Like in this large yellow-ish painting entitled Helper, the brightest part of the painting, which is this yellow, when I walked in, I thought was like really thick paint. And it turns out that it's in fact dyed fabric, which has like less of a material presence than almost any other part of the painting, right? But carries this weight of color in a way that makes you expect that it would be kind of like materially denser. And I think that those complications are part of this kind of really dense play that allows you to like stake claims in the work and then also kind of question where they come from. But for example, like in this painting, the things that are piece, the things that are nameable are not only like triangles and fabric and textile, but like these two little hands at the bottom, which like take a while to see, but I recognize like these small handprints at the bottom of the painting. And then the structure, which both looks as though it has a relationship to like Paul Klee-ish arrows and might also be a menorah. Like there are all of these different symbols that function inside of this work that kind of announce themselves and then recede from view, like the arches, and then become complicated by materiality. And that starts to build this story about the abstraction of the painting, its personal location, these questions about a subject, right? And whether subjectivity as an adjective might be different than a subject in a painting. I know that was a kind of a long description, but I wonder if you might talk to us a little bit about some of the iconography that you're using and how you're thinking about materiality and surface in relationship to icons or symbols in the work.
Yeah. Well, it's very layered, like the way that you describe it is my experience of it. I tend to kind of come upon imagery or some symbolic imagery with things that are kind of already happening. Like one of an early example would have been like the form of the snake that was in some previous works, but not in this exhibition directly. Although there is like a big kind of like S shape, which is a good example of how something like that arises, where like I felt like I was moving from the zigzag, thinking about the weft thread going back and forth, thinking about time, and then like this shape of the snake kind of like emerged out of that. And then it's also so related to what I was thinking about. And I don't think that that's an accident. Like, I think that these stories come from weaving. I think they do. I think like, and they're very intertwined. The way we think about time, narrative, knowledge. I think it's all pretty immersive. So anyway, so as I'm working on these things, or like in this case, a doorway, or like an opening, and references to architecture that come from thinking about structure, there are like they seem to come out of the work on their own. And then as the artist, it's my job, I feel like, to kind of like observe them, think about what they mean, what are they like, what are they not like, and sort of like try to negotiate their place in the broader language of symbolic meaning. Yeah, for that piece, the like form of the menorah, it was like kind of already there, and then I made it just ever so slightly more explicit. But even the art, like there are so many arches and forms that follow the same logic and the same pattern in previous works, but here it appears in this other way. And then the hands, I will say, like it's a bit of a mystery, how that, because I love to put hands in my work, and I see my hands all the time while I'm working. Like, I don't think I accidentally ever wove a hand. So like that doesn't quite like apply in this case, but they are so much a part of the work, and there they are, and I was thinking when I was painting them, like the fluidity of the surface and the hand, like from like my intimacy with the surface, how like my hands would almost like just go into it. And also about my daughter who, well, she's like 3 now, so she's pretty good at using her hands. Still learning, lifelong journey, but like the power that they give her, and the joy of like being able to do things with your hands, it's just amazing. So that was also like a big part of that piece, was just thinking about, wow, hands. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about your relationship to language. One of the, I know this is a little bit of a turn, but one of the paintings in your show is called Keeper of the Vineyards, which is a quote from the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon. And that's a really amazing mystical piece of writing, love poem. And one of the things that I was thinking as I was reading it, and you and I were having a conversation about it, so is not just that so much of the speaker's lives is accounted for in this kind of like very sort of metaphorical but steamy love poem. You know, like they're attending to their groves, they're attending to children, there's a sociality to other people asking where the lover has come or gone. Um, but there's also this feature of love poetry that makes everything kind of like infinitely comparable, you know, like because the beloved is beloved, they can become like wine and sheep and stars and the moon and red, you know, and light and the doorway. You know what I mean? They become, everything is placed in relationship to them. And I was thinking about this in relationship to your work because of the kinds of comparisons that you make in your discussions, both of processes and imagery, right? The way that you were talking about hands and looking at hands and your daughter, the personal, the abstract, the formal. But also because I think the forms in your work have this like kind of like infinitely comparable element to them, you know. In this painting where there's an embedded body, I remember looking at it and seeing like champagne flutes or something like this. Or like, you know, something could be a hand, but also like a profile. There, or like, you know, something could become a symbol and turn into a zigzag. And I just wanted to ask you more about your relationship to text, maybe to poetic structures. And then, you know, like maybe we can get into the Song of Songs or vice versa, sort of use one to lead into the other or however you like.
Well, I guess the way that I like what you're sort of describing are these like quality, like I guess there's two ways of thinking about it, I think. Like as a mystical text, like when I first started thinking about that, and reading this, it was just like a really amazing example of the way that mystical traditions often use like earthly metaphors and stories to talk about love of God or divine love, or and that that kind of like separation from the divine is sort of like our fundamental state, like our more basic state, and that all of these other desires that we have are kind of just like reflections of that, or manifestations of it, but that like the real thing that we are desiring is the infinite. So um, so if that's the case, like what is the body? You know, like is it a house? Is it red? You know, it sort of throws all of it into the context of this like bigger abstraction, that's really a reflection of something else. And then if that's what you're sort of left with, how do you talk about it? And in a lot of mystical traditions, I think one of the ways of talking about it is through attributes. So through descriptions and qualities. So the most generous or the softest or the strongest, or you know, these qualities that are sort of removed from the thing. and that is so aesthetic. So I feel like that has been a really productive way for me to think about the meaning of abstraction in my own work, like something being, the most gentle, like the piece Blue Boom being like such a like gentle space, and like the emotive quality of it, that feels really generative for me as I move through different works. Um, yeah, can't remember what else I think that's the end.
Yeah. Um, it also brings to mind like the idea of longing in general in your work. And I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about um, longing and desire inside of your practice. I know you just mentioned longing for the infinite.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a big part of it. But to also like really embrace the earthiness of it too. Um, and I guess like even like going back when I thinking about like geometry, there's a relationship there between like geometry and shapes, and how do you think about them and deal with them, like the idea of like zero versus like how do you construct a triangle, and there is a relationship of desire there between the two, that is, yeah, I feel like it propels the work for me. um, yeah. And then I think in the press really kind of spoke, going back to our other previous conversation, um, referenced some of the personal materials that are in the surface as like moments of longing. Um, and I think that that's also a mysterious but important thing for me right now, like to think about these materials that are kind of public materials, I would call them, like the art, maybe like the art materials are like public. Like you can buy linen in the store and it has this vernacular meaning that's very different. And then to have this like my mom's shirt is in one of the pieces, and I dyed it purple so it like goes with the piece, but it has like the embroidery. So you can tell that like it's from a garment, and an older garment, like from the 70s. Yeah, these like moments of personal longing in the context of these materials that are um, performing like a different role. Yeah.
As you were talking about the difference between geometry and shapes, um, we have an image of some of your drawings, preparatory drawings up right now. It's worth remembering for that, for as long as I've known you, you've also mentioned how you like all when as a younger person you were also very interested in math.
Mm.
um, and also that like for all of the earthiness and all of these intuitive relations that you're describing as you make the work, there's also quite a lot of schematic planning that goes into all of the larger works that you make. And they're very carefully attended to as compositions. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about drawing and planning in your work.
Yeah. So these drawings are all for that piece we were talking about, Helper, the yellow and pink one. Um, and yeah, I'm kind of like going back and forth between like shapes, more iconic imagery. I'm also thinking about how I'm going to make it when I'm making these drawings. So I'm thinking about the structure, like how is this thing going to like hold together in a singular plane? So there's a lot of like kind of structural things that are also compositional, and drawing is a way to be pretty fluid about that. And you can see some of these earlier ones where like they really don't resemble the piece. Like the drawings go like from the top left across, like in order. So like some of the earlier ones, they don't resemble the piece at all. And then some of the ones at the bottom are like pretty close. So the drawing, it's not like I get the drawing perfect and then I start when I'm like pretty sure about things. But there are some like really big shifts that happen, like the beginning, like the initial structural idea of the piece was to have like a top and a bottom. And that sort of remained in the end, but it was like superseded by this other structure of like the triangle, and then like this like parallelogram that goes off of the triangle that you can see there at the end. So that became the structural, like the main thing by the end of the drawings, while a lot of the other stuff is like still included. And then that the last drawings that you saw there were when I was like pretty sure about how the piece was going to look. And then these drawings I made while I was working on the piece. And so here I'm like trying to figure out how big everything is supposed to be. I wove some of the fabric, or like half of the fabrics or something like that in the piece. So like I'm like measuring like how I'm going to construct this stuff. And then also the image changed again. And then I was kind of trying to measure out this pattern. That's the diamond shapes with the zigzags that go through them. And I was trying to figure out the scale of the pattern, how it was going to like modify it. And I have all these drawings about that then became, by the end, another piece in the show. So like this is kind of like, I feel like how it kind of moves from like one thing to another, so that like by the end I have this whole other idea, and then moving forward from there, it develops into something else. So through this drawing practice, like it can be like pretty fluid how the imagery is developed, from these various sources.
It strikes me also that repetition, which is that repetition is another way of keeping time. It has another relationship to time. And that in earlier bodies of work, you repeated compositions sometimes, or structures, and sort of varied materials or opacity, color, but that there's also the repetition of the pattern in your work, right? That repetition happens on the level of like, a small pattern is like a kind of modular element, as well as these larger compositional organizing gestures, like big shapes, or, the S and a right corner or something like that. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to repeating, or to repetition.
Yeah. Well, I think it's like, on a basic way, it's like a way of just creating any meaning. You repeat something and next time it's different. And so that's like kind of the building blocks of everything, and how you can create relationships. And then I think about it in that way. I thought about it a lot in terms of memory at a certain point, like having like repeating something from a further distance and remembering it differently, and having that sort of guide the piece, like the same composition, but now I'm mad, or something. I don't know, or now I'm fine. I don't know, like, so something like that. But then also like it became important a pretty important thing in this body of work. The idea of the modular as opposed to the repeated pattern. So that was like sort of another way for me to like expand the composition and the idea of symmetry without negating it. Was like, okay, let's like the modular is like just like a slightly more complicated symmetrical thing that like repeats itself. But that it creates this like other movement and unpredictability. Or like there are some of the like medium-sized works where the triangles flop in a sort of like random way. That was like pretty generative for me. And it's not like it's like revolutionary or anything, but it was like this body of work was really about incorporating all of those things to try to find a way out of how I was viewing the world. So like that was definitely an important one.
Julia, what was that way of viewing the world? And how did you find and what's on the other side?
Well, you know, I think my ideas about autonomy
Mm.
uh, were really challenged um, uh, in the past few years, like having a child. Like I think like the earlier works, I mean, I don't think I would have said this at all when I was making them, but like in retrospect, because it's just what I knew, it was like invisible to me, but they were sort of about like me,
Mm.
they were about, and they were fluid. Like it's not like I'm separate from the world, but there was a kind of strength and energy to them of me, like as an individual. Um, and Having like a little tiny baby really changed like my relationship to myself, and like what a person is, and that maybe I'm not one. you know? So yeah, I think like just like like my sense of self became like very jumbled.
Mm.
And that these kind of like more the way that I had been thinking about it just didn't resonate anymore. But I didn't know how like to move forward visually, because I had fixed ideas about things and I had a language I had developed that I couldn't. Anyway, it needed a lot of work to expand.
I wanted to, I know there's like so much to talk about, but I wanted to ask a little bit about the relationship to geography in your work. Um, the show is called Rivers on the Inside, and I think there are sometimes um, like reference maybe is too strong a word, but like an inclination that something could be a landscape or a metaphor for a landscape in your work. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this idea of landscape or something which is exterior and interiority, right? Or the idea of the interior, the river inside, which is, anyway, and how this relates to whether and how this relates to some of these structures that we've been talking about.
um, I think um, that I really miss being outside more, and being around the natural world more. Um, but that like one of the ways I've like coped with that in the past few years is by sort of embracing that like I am natural, or like I am the natural world. And so like all of the things that are happening that I long for, like I am those things. So I think like that's part of it. Um, and also just like a desire for interiority. I feel like a lot of things right now in the world are processed externally. Like I feel like I'm processing this like really like so much emotion like through external events and through um this like visible phenomenon. But that like there's so much of it that's interior that needs to be processed in an interior way. Um, and looked at in ourselves. So I don't know, it just kind of like just a very strong desire for that, I think is part of it. Yeah.
Hearing you talk about it makes me think about like also a historical relationship to abstraction, and also like geometric abstraction as having to interiority, interior space, and in some cases a relationship to the infinite. If we're talking about like the spiritualist vector of early 20th century abstraction, but also like the textile work of so many artists and so many women in the mid 20th century. And I was just wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about geometry and feminism in your work.
Um, well, I mean, I've always been really interested in geometry and in math, like as you said. And that to me doesn't, is pretty ungendered, although like I guess like mathematics is like a predominantly male field, I guess. But I guess I don't know. There's like a lot of art about that right now. I don't know to add. I guess it's like cool to like reframe abstraction, like in the ways that people have been reframing it, thinking about diagrams, and like other strategies and like the applied arts and different things that have contributed to that history. And weaving being like a huge one. So but I guess I feel entitled to that. I guess I had very good teachers as a student. I feel very lucky to have had them that showed me a lot of artists that had been making work that gave me the confidence to not really have to think about this as like a revolutionary or feminist thing, but like something that I was just like going to do. So that's kind of like my feeling about it.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think that's one of the goals, right?
Yeah.
I think that's maybe a good place for us to end and to open it up to questions. But thank you so much, Julia, for your thinking and your work, and also your generosity in the answers that you've given.
Thank you.
Julia, Gabby, this conversation has been such a pleasure to listen to. Thank you both so much for your generosity and for sharing so much about your practice, Julia. It was a pleasure. And Gabby, your insights throughout were really brilliant. We have a couple of questions from the audience, and I encourage audience members who have a question to post it in the chat, and we'll turn to you shortly. The first question is going to be from Courtney. Courtney, I'll give you the chance to unmute.
Hi, guys. Okay, so after seeing your show, I noticed that there's a big shift from what I can see from like more open forms to more closed forms. And not in a bad way. I didn't like they're not closed to us, but just like formally closed. And something I feel like I associate with your work is a lot of like air and openness, sort of like you can see the wall behind it, or you can sort of like feel the space. And so I noticed on the larger works that they're sort of flat and don't have these like open passages. And I wanted to know a little bit more about that and if that was a conscious decision.
Well, I had been making some pieces that were more open before.
Yeah.
And I think I got frustrated with them, and I wanted to do things like I was trying to do, I think, too many things at once. Like I was pushing the imagery and the materiality at the same time, and it wasn't working physically. Like I was like just struggling so much trying to get them um to be like, if it doesn't hold together, it's not visible. Like you can't see it, like the work,
Right.
So I mean you could see it, but you can't understand it. So I think I like had been working on this really large piece and really, really struggling with that. And then as I moved to the next one, I was like, okay, I need to kind of like pare down the material choices here. Um, because structurally, I'm not sure how it will work. So I think it was just sort of like a kind of natural back and forth for me where I like move from focusing on one thing to another thing at different points. And yeah, so that I will return to that, but maybe when I'm like more confident with like the new shapes and I sort of know how they'll act, how they'll play with the other shapes. Yeah.
That totally makes sense.
Yeah.
I was just curious. It felt like some new sort of shift, but that
It
sounds,
is. It does. Well, it creates its own meaning too. So like
yeah.
because of that, like the work is more spatial
Hmm.
and more image related and like
Hmm.
more of all these other things. So then now I have to like think about it, I guess.
Yeah, I think in some way it makes it so like before you were giving us the wall behind it or the air space behind it, and now you're actually like playing with that space in terms of like imagery and shapes like within those like pockets between larger forms. So it's just it's exciting. It was nice to see.
Thank you.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks for that question. And thank you, Julia, for that answer. The next question, which I believe is the last question, unless anyone else has a question, is going to be from Eleanor at the Rail. Eleanor, I am passing it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julia and Gabby, for this conversation. Julia, I'm wondering if you could talk about how you know when a work is finished or how you make that decision, or if it's more natural than that.
I think like things definitely like slow down toward the end. Like I have a lot of like decisions that happen, like I need to do this. There like gets to this, like it's kind of slow at the beginning. And then like in the middle, it's like, oh, there's a lot happening. It's like very active. And then it's like just starts to kind of slow down again. And I think what happens is that I start to see it in too many different ways. So like I'll think, oh, this part needs to be more one thing or another. But then the next day I'll come in and say, oh no, it's actually this other thing. And like so my decisions really slow down because the thing has become like too multifaceted. And that's when I stop being able to really make a good decision about it because it keeps changing, it has too many fluid parts. And then that's like when it's over.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor. We had another question come in, Julia. A great question from Michelle. So I am going to pass the mic over to Michelle to ask directly.
Okay.
Michelle, you're not unmuted yet. There should be a button to unmute. There you
Okay.
go. There we go.
All right. So thank you to everyone, and thank you, Julia. I wanted to be at your opening, but I will go see your show. So I'm going to read my question that I wrote. So much of the recent handmade focus, the return to involvement with craft being created these days, involves the use of apprentices, but many artists would never have other people create their work. In the tradition of weaving, often artists, quote unquote, collaborated with weavers as artisans to translate their work into fiber materials. But your work seems to require your direct involvement in its making, its techniques, etc. How or what do you think is important to you about your direct engagement with your materials and design and the creation of your works? So in other words, so what makes it different? Like, why would you not use an apprentice, or maybe you would use an apprentice?
I think having an extra hand is really nice. Sometimes, especially if you're having like making really big work, like I do need help. And I think like, but I guess I think all of it is so important. Like making the work is really important to me. Like sort of like what I was saying before when I was talking with Gabby about like the vase. Like if I didn't weave, I wouldn't have any of these ideas, because the way that tension works and the way that everything becomes interdependent and how it makes this image it's a magical experience to me. And it and I have been doing it and I'm still learning so much from it. So to me, it's very generative. And even things like learning how to dye, like different dyeing techniques, how they work, like it's so generative. So if I was like giving it to somebody else to make it, I don't know where my ideas would come from. Like I would just, like I think it would be really hard to but I also think that like asking for help is really important, and like needing help is important, and like that's also.
Could you just to clarify that, like in what instances would the help not limit your generative creative process? Like, and if you do use assistance, like when is it okay for you to do it?
Well, I have had one assistant that I worked with, like one person who I've like known for many, 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 many years, who helped me with stuff, and we were, and she helped me. I mean, it's not like I have to do it. Like if I don't do it, it loses something. If I don't do it, I lose something by not having the experience. But maybe what I'm losing in some of these cases is just discipline or something like that, or like more patience, that I did the whole thing myself. And maybe I'm willing to sacrifice that in order to be able to move a little more quickly through my idea. And I had another thing I was going to say. Oh, but like, I also think like learning how to work with another person is a valuable experience. And a lot of these practices are very collective. And like that is not something that I've like really taken on, but it's not something that I'm opposed to. But like sharing the work and the community surrounding the work, I think that's part of it too. I think that's good.
Thank you, Michelle, for so much for that question. And thank you, Julia, for that answer. Thank you all for your questions today. And thank you again to Julia and to Gabby for this conversation, which was such a pleasure to listen to. Thank you to Sky, and thank you to the team at Derek Eller Gallery for your support with images in preparation for today. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsors our NSE program and makes daily conversations like this one possible. They also support our growing archive, which you can find on the Rails YouTube channel, and where this video will be posted very, very soon. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our writers, our production staff, and our operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Beverly Sims and Amanda Glebezi on the event of Cut Paste on view at Susan Inglett Gallery here in New York. And as is real tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for being here today. And thank you to Julia and to Gaby.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.